Extract 6. Vincent Frankenstein. Date 1800s. The intruder was one of the women from the town. She was soaked through, and when she was several yards into the cave, she leant against a wall and sobbed. I was still full of fear and anger, but a speck of compassion grew in my heart as I saw the sorrow and pain on her face. Yet I still didn't dare to reveal myself in case there was treachery in her misery. After a few minutes, she slumped to the floor and continued to sob. As I debated what to do, I was caught by some twist of fate. A need to sneeze took me. I tried to hold it and conceal the sound, but the small stutter was amplified by the cave. The woman, who was about 20 years of age, darted her head in my direction and stood up quickly. "Who's there?" she called, backing towards the exit. Stepping from the shadows, I hesitated, and she spoke before I could decide what to say. "You," she stuttered, and broke down in tears. Through the tears I managed to decipher her words. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." A sudden passion came over me, and I shouted at her. "Where's my father? What were those monstrous women? Why do you want to hurt men so much?" She breathed deeply, trying to compose herself. "Your father is dead," she managed to say. "And the others?" I uttered in disbelief. "I'm sorry," she repeated. "I never wanted anything like this to happen." Her apology said it all. I managed to stumble to my rock and sat on it, holding my head in my hands. She took a few steps towards me. "They are looking for you, but this should be far enough away that they do not find us. Can you forgive my part in this?" she pleaded. I couldn't speak. She took the silence as an invitation to say more, and I listened while trying to digest the pain and loss. My father was dead. "My name is Mary," she said. "I was raised in a village not far from here, and like all the women, was seen as inferior to men. It's no excuse for what has taken place here, and what I've been part of. But I need you to understand, so you don't think me so wicked. Many times we joked about having a more equal standing with the men, but it was only a dream. Then one day a woman from our village told us how she had met the matriarch of these giants. At first she had been frightened by the shocking sight, but the matriarch talked to her and spoke of the things we joked about, and how she would show us the way. All we wanted was the equality we thought she offered. So we followed her and found she had other followers from other villages. We listened to her story and the story of her daughters. There were times when we saw sparks of cruelty in them, but these were overshadowed by our wishes and her promises of help. Eventually I saw her true colours with the punishments she dealt out to men of other villages. I wanted to run, but I didn't, for fear of what would happen to me. I didn't know what the other women thought about what was going on, and was scared to say anything. In the chaos of tonight's horrors, I finally decided to flee in the hope I could get away and not be a part of their murderous mission to subject men to them. It's not what we wanted. I cannot believe they would all want this. If I had known all that would happen, I would never have met the giants." As she talked, I gained some control of the pain. All this stemmed from how men treated women. I struggled to see what she meant. My father had always loved my mother and treated her with a great deal of kindness. I had always been a good man and done my part. I confronted Mary. "Equality? What do you mean? We have our roles to play as men and women." There was a pause as she thought about what to say. "What is your name?" she finally said. The question wasn't what I expected, but I answered it, and then she answered my questions. "Vincent. It doesn't need to be roles or specific categories for men and women. And the ones we do have give all the choices and options to men. Do you see that, Vincent? Men can follow careers, be involved in society freely. They have the final word on everything, and at times they can be very cruel. Whereas women are confined to the housekeeping and raising children, and having to do as they are told. Is this fair and equal?" I could see the passion in her voice and body language. She watched me as I dissected her passionate speech. A silence fell between us. I took this time to think about it all. What she said made sense. There is a limited amount of choice women have because of the rules society followed. And in many cases I have seen that women were required to be subordinate to men. But it is just the way it is. Through my new awareness and seeing her pain and passion, part of me started to forgive her for all that had happened. Furthermore, she had fled from them and confessed to me all this, so I could not be angry with her. I was angry at the monsters for what they had done, and how, for a reason I couldn't completely fathom, they had twisted this idea of equality into a plan to reap misery on all men. My only concern now was to stop them. I forgive your part in this, Mary, I began, breaking the silence. All that matters is stopping these monsters. If we make it to a more populated town, we can bring armed men here and end this. I know where we need to go. We should leave at first light, she replied. Mary is resting now as I write. I will have to rally men, and even writing men gives me pause and sparks a tapestry of thoughts and feelings. But now is not the time to explore these. I will find the men and convince them of the existence of the monsters. I'll rid the world of this plague as my father wished. I am partially concerned as to what has happened to the original male monster my father created. There is no way of knowing. Dawn is approaching, and the nightmare continues. Extract 7. Vincent Frankenstein. Date 1800s. We have made it to some resemblance of civilization. I might almost believe last night to be a dream. My head is throbbing this morning, and I am piecing together the events of last night, the effects of too much drink hindering me in this task. When we arrived, Mary and I booked ourselves into rooms at the local guest house. I struggled to sleep, so decided to drink, because it might relax me. The plan was to speak to the locals the following day and explain our ordeal. I made my way to the tavern, and once inside I took my drink to a corner table. I sat in the shadows and tried not to think of all that had happened, and all I must still attempt. It was as I took my second drink that a strangely dressed gentleman entered and walked to the bar. I had read of these cowboys of the Wild West, but didn't expect one to be this far north. What stood out first was the large-brimmed hat shadowing his face and the long leather coat that almost swept the floor. The coat appeared black, but as he moved it seemed to change to a lighter grey and even brown at times. He glanced in my direction, and the light finally revealed his face. A face that looked young and old, beaten and soft, caring and hateful, and as he looked at me I saw his eyes and tried not to gasp. One normal eye looked back at me, and the other was what appeared to be a glass eye, as white as snow. Before I could compose myself and look away, he gave me a half smile. He stroked the golden stubble on his face and walked towards me. I looked around nervously, trying to pretend that I hadn't been staring, and took a sip of my drink as casually as I could. I then felt his shadow over me, and I looked up. Good evening, I managed. Good evening, he replied, with a full smile this time. His accent twanged with casual confidence, but also with an underlying sophistication. Forgive me for the intrusion, he continued, but you look like you have a story to tell, and I'm in the mood for a tale. Do you mind sharing it with a weary traveller? Not to be rude, sir, but how do you know I have a story to tell? I asked. Call it a skill, he replied. May I join you? He swept his long coat under the table as he sat. It was now more brown than black. Removing his hat, he placed it on the table to reveal short hair lighter than his stubble. My name is John Idaho Thatcher, he said as he sat, and we engaged in some polite conversation about our backgrounds. He listened in a way I don't think anyone had ever listened before. It was as though every word was important to him, and he was according to memory what I was saying. I must confess it was good to talk so openly to someone who truly listened. We drank several more strong drinks as we talked, and he paid for them all, refusing my offers by saying it was good to share his recent good fortune. So what's your story, then? He finally said, in that twang I was growing to find very pleasant. You probably won't believe it, I said. I can be very open-minded, he replied. I felt I could be open, although it may have been the drink. I relayed my story and told him of my father's diary, the monsters and the matriarch's hate for men, and how they had killed my father and many others before I fled, and how I met Mary. As I unfolded the tale, he seemed fascinated by it. When I finished, he sat back. Well, that's quite the story, he said, so loudly that it disrupted the silence of the now empty tavern. You believe me? I asked, pondering a last drink and tipping my glass slightly, emphasizing its emptiness. Of course, he replied, twisting in his seat. He called out, Barkeep, one last drink for Vincent, if you would be so kind. How do you know it's true? Call it another skill, he said, giving his warm yet sly half smile. I can help you take care of these monsters. barkeep came over at the same time and placed a new drink in front of me. I said my thanks, but kept my eyes forward, waiting to hear how he could help. He didn't answer, and seemed to be waiting for me to ask again. The suspense was too much, so I complied. "How will you kill them?" I asked. I remember a slight flash of disapproval in his face. Then he pulled his coat aside, and I followed his gaze. I couldn't help noticing a strange kind of waistcoat he had on. It was made of a thick, hard-looking material and covered in thin, intricate gold, silver, and copper cogs, all connected by copper wires that wrapped around his torso and back. They all came from a center point in the middle of his chest, and from what looked like a curious brooch of a white dove. It was about the size of the palm of my hand. It had the same cogs and wires over the surface and almost looked alive. I continued to follow his gaze down to his hip and saw a pistol in a holster. "You'll need more than that," I laughed, and took a swig of my drink. "It would surprise you what this could do," he said, and suddenly stood up. "Watch," he continued, and pulled the strange-looking pistol from his hip. He turned a dial on the side. It made a click-click-click sound, like a watch being wound. Taking his empty glass, he placed it at the far end of the room and put some coins on the bar. "Compensation," he said to the barkeep. Striding to our table, he turned back and pointed the weapon at the glass. He fired it, and a small ball of what looked like blue lightning shot across the room and melted the glass. It continued to melt and made a hole in the table. The glass had vanished. He holstered the weapon, strode to the bar again, and placed another coin on the table. "For your discretion," and he winked. Returning to his seat, he said, "That's one of its settings, and at a lower power. It'll take care of your problem." I was stunned. I stood up and walked over to the table and put my hand through the hole. "Incredible," I remarked. Returning, I stood by our table and drank what was left of my drink. "So tomorrow we shall return and take care of them," I said. He stood. "Not we, but I." I looked at him. "You can trust me, Vincent. I'll solve this problem. I can promise you that. I'll find you when it's done. What you must do is leave with Mary. Listen to her, Vincent. She sounds like an inspired woman, and the equality she speaks of is possible. I must get some rest now. Take care of yourself, Vincent, and I'll see you again." He lifted his hat and turned to leave. It was such an abrupt ending to the hours we had conversed that I simply replied, "And you, John. Good luck." As the word luck left my lips, the door of the tavern swung shut behind him. With him gone, I sat down to think about all that had happened. Would he really help me? Would he kill the monsters? I have to accept that killing them is the best option for the human race, though it does sadden me that it could not have been resolved another way. A few minutes went by, and my thoughts turned to my adventure, filled as it was with horrors. But I was interrupted by a cough from the barkeep. I realized he wanted to end his long night. I left and made my way to my room at the guest house. Slumping onto my bed, I had fallen asleep without any trouble. It is morning now, and I must go see Mary.